Right, so good afternoon, welcome. My name is David Muller. I'm from Homes England, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this summer learning programme. This offers a series of knowledge sharing sessions on topics that you have told us are of interest to you. Today's event is Regenerating Sustainably and Zero Carbon, presented by Stantec. Could we have the next slide, please? So the summer learning programme is brought to you by Homes England's local government capacity centre. The topic of this session is an important focus in Homes England's new strategic plan. This is our new strategic plan mission. And the next slide is the outline of our objectives as outlined in the strategic plan. We have 5 objectives and 3 focused on overlapping categories of workplace, homes, and the sector. You'll be able to look at those objectives in the slide deck when it is forwarded to you. Could we have the next slide, please? So this is the local government capacity centre, what our mission is. We established the centre following extensive research and consultation with you across local government and with the whole range of other partners to determine where authorities most need support and how this is best delivered. And we look forward to hearing how we did in the survey poll at the end of this session. Can we have the next slide, please? So the agenda for today, we're doing welcome and introductions, then we'll ask Connie Davis, Head of Sustainability and Design and across Homes England, to introduce our strategic plan. And then we'll have Lucy Wood, Director of Climate Solutions at Stantec, setting the scene, and Gary Stevens, Planning Director at Stantec, discussing overcoming the challenges. And then at the end, we will have a case study and a Q&A hosted by myself. So I'm delighted to hand over to our first presenter, Connie Davis from Homes England.
Good afternoon. Thanks, David. So I'm the Head of Sustainability and Design Implementation at Homes England. We're quite a new function in the agency, and our role is to shape our future direction around sustainability. So I'd like to give you a very kind of short overview and a bit of a context of what we're doing here in the agency. Next slide, please. So as you can see from the slide in front of you and from the mission that David just presented on screen, we've got absolute renewed focus on sustainability and high quality design. It's actually quite a sea change for the agency and gives us that mandate now to prioritise sustainability and high quality design alongside other targets and priorities like the delivery of new homes, obviously those numbers, and obviously receipts that we can then recycle back into delivering more homes. So really important for us to kind of start setting out our stall in terms of what this means for Homes England. Next slide, please. So 2 out of our 5 new strategic objectives in our strategic plan, which was recently published, are around sustainability and design. And as you can see there on screen, these are high-level objectives, but they give us that scope to actually shape specifically what that means for the agency and our business. As I said, we have a new implementation team which works really closely with our teams of experts in terms of sustainability and design. And we're looking at how we can deliver sustainability within all of our programs and our functions. So from acquisitions to loans, we're looking at how this impacts those different functions. Next slide, please. So this slide just outlines the breadth of our focus, really. So our focus is on anything that touches the built environment. And you can see here that as well as looking at sort of interventions to the homes themselves, we're looking at sustainability in the widest sense. So things like social impact, social justice. We're also looking at our own estate, so the land that we own, and how we run our own business, so that corporate sustainability. So we'll be doing things like measuring our carbon footprint as a baseline, and then looking at those different measures that we need to reduce those emissions. Next slide, please. So in addition to thinking about sort of metrics and targets in relation to sustainability, what we're doing here in the agency is we're thinking about how we develop an outcomes-led approach. I've given an example there on screen of one of the outcomes that we're looking at. So nature thrives is protected and accessible to all. So what we're trying to do is look at what we want to actually achieve at the end, but we're allowing partners to get to that in a number of different ways. So in this context, it may be by nature-based solutions. It might be by introducing measures like hedgehog highways or swift boxes. It might be by having an increased biodiversity net gain target. And in combination, those different measures will deliver that end outcome. Next slide, please. So why are we looking at outcomes? As I've said, they allow for that flexibility and that innovation. So we can work with partners like those of you on the call in local authorities, and also developers too, to look at how we can actually deliver against those outcomes. We're also able to kind of weigh up the different benefits of these different sustainability elements and look at that big picture view rather than just ticking a box in terms of a particular metric or standard. We also think that it's really important that we have really clear and universal set of outcomes. So as I've reflected on before, we do a number of things within Homes England, from acting like a bank in our investments team to having a land business and buying land. And obviously liaising with partners like you very early on in big scale regeneration schemes. So the idea of these outcomes is that they could be embedded into all of these programs, into loan agreements, for example, into business cases, so that we achieve a universal set of outcomes across all of our programs. Next slide, please. So in terms of next steps and what that looks like, just there on screen, we've got kind of the three tenets, if you like, of how we want to deliver this. So we know, as many of you on the call know, that we can't just deliver this as an add-on. It has to be absolutely embedded into our culture, into our processes. It has to be supported by training. And we have to increase capacity and skills in this area. The other point is, of course, we need to understand what our baseline is, and we need to make sure that we're monitoring that in order that we can continuously improve as we move through. So in terms of next steps, this is kind of a very quick overview and a quick flavour of what we're planning. And what we hope to launch later in the year, but there certainly will be more to come. By the end of this year, we'll be launching our high-level approach to sustainability and design, which will give a lot more detail on what we're planning, but very much the focus of that will be that outcomes wheel that I showed you, and also an indication of what that means for all of our partners in the various different areas. Right, I'm going to hand over to Lucy now from Stantec, who's going to give you a more in-depth view of net zero in the regeneration space. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. Really pleased to be taking part in this learning seminar this afternoon. I'm going to start by setting the context and some drivers for sustainability, and then run through some of the considerations for regeneration projects that also take account of future trends and where we know we're going in terms of sustainability. Then Gary's going to talk about implementation, overcoming the challenges, and drawing on a case study to help. Next slide, please. So that's just the agenda that I ran through there. But as you see, we will talk about the context, think about the road to net zero, then dig a bit deeper into the challenges and talk about Friary Park Estate, Ealing as a case study. Next slide, please. And just a reminder, please do put any questions in the chat as we go through, and Gary and I will be pleased to take them at the end. So to start with, I'm sure as we can all appreciate, regeneration is not easy. It's not straightforward at all. Deprivation is often entrenched over long periods of time, with people caught in a vicious cycle, and that can be really hard to address. Challenges are complex, so approaches to tackle them must be multifunctional and consider economic, physical, social and environmental issues simultaneously. It's not a sticking plaster approach. By physical, I mean the buildings and surrounding infrastructure as being one part, but obviously completely linked to the environment that development sits in and the people and the communities that it serves and in the surrounding area. We are in turbulent times with many systemic issues affecting local government simultaneously, of course. We have a housing crisis with many people in temporary and or crowded accommodation. The cost of living crisis is affecting us all, but it's affecting the most deprived parts of society disproportionately. Energy, housing, of course, rent, mortgages are all affected. With the majority of local authorities now having declared a climate emergency, and also many have declared a biodiversity emergency, we have these issues to consider in the context of regeneration. And it's important to look at all of these holistically to ensure the best outcomes and also the best results in terms of our wider sustainability. Next slide, please. So why do we need regeneration to start with? I mean, it is quite obvious, really. We know that the environment we live in is absolutely critical to our well-being and therefore our overall prosperity as a society. Places in need of regeneration are often where there's a lack of economic activity, again, as I just mentioned, and that can be embedded over generations, really. People can be socially isolated, and there are often weak market conditions that make it more difficult to make a positive change. Buildings can be outdated, can be unsafe or unhealthy, with both damp and fire risk both making the headlines recently. But with climate change, risk that they've seen elsewhere in Europe just these last weeks, and surface water flooding, more extreme weather events on the rise. We've seen wind, we've seen floods, certainly in this country. But all of the associated health problems that come with a changing climate are also likely to increase and are then exacerbated when the environment that people are living in is not now fit for purpose. Buildings can also be expensive to run, of course, and that really doesn't help with the living crisis, the cost of living crisis that communities are living through at the moment. Technology and lifestyles have changed, particularly in the post-COVID era. And this can mean that more modern buildings and decent quality public realm can really transform people's well-being, as some who work in the service industry are spending more time within their home communities. More modern buildings and decent public realm can also help us to tackle the climate and biodiversity emergencies. But of course, all of this comes at a cost. The public sector plays a critical role as a catalyst for redevelopment, where conditions are less favourable for the private sector. And I know later that Gary's going to talk a bit about partnering and how important that is in delivering the best possible outcomes. Next slide, please. So in terms of the climate change context, there is scientific consensus on climate change caused by human activity since the Industrial Revolution, and the repeated warnings from the Climate Change Committee and Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change mean that there really is no time to bury our heads in the sand anymore. This is happening, and it is already happening. It's not happening in the future, but right now. And those extreme events I mentioned earlier are just testament to that. This graph shows that really with no climate policies in place, world average temperatures would shoot up to close to 5 degrees of warming, with catastrophic consequences according to models. Even with current policies, we'll see a degree of warming that would cause wholesale changes to our way of life. I was at a really interesting seminar last week with a scientist from the British Antarctic Survey there. And I think it's worth mentioning here that when we hear about rises in temperature, this is a global average. And in fact, the closer you get to the poles, the more drastic those changes are. And that's sort of the change of how temperatures will affect different parts of the globe is really important to take into consideration, particularly when we're considering social change and what might happen in terms of migratory patterns and how that might actually have real social consequences on our own country. So it's worth bearing in mind. It's not just 1.5 degrees as a flat rate across the globe. The Paris Agreement to limit warming to low 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels is what scientists say we should try to achieve to minimise the damage, both human and environmental cost. What this graph shows is that there is and there will continue to be climate change even without strong policy, so we must be prepared. And climate change adaptation is also absolutely critical in regeneration, which I'll come to. Next slide, please. So this is the UK government's commitment and their pathway to net zero, which shows how emissions have to reduce to get to our target for 2050. In their June 2023 update, so just recently, the Climate Change Committee stated that they have less confidence that the UK will meet its goals towards net zero from 2030 onwards. So it's not looking particularly promising. In its March 2023 report to Parliament, the Climate Change Committee warned that the UK is woefully underprepared in terms of its climate change adaptation and resilience response. So again, this has to be the cornerstone of any regeneration project because it can have really quite severe human cost, health issues, etc. Next slide, please. So this slide, again, just setting some of the scientific context. It's important to know where emissions come from to start with when tackling any regeneration project. Just a note on this that the 2022 figures are still provisional. So this is data from 2021, but still gives us helpful context. So this shows the sources of climate emissions, of carbon emissions in the UK. You'll note that the energy sector, that top black line, has decarbonised substantially since 1990, and this is due mostly to the increase in renewable energy generation. Transport, business and the residential categories are also large contributors, but one obvious difference here is that they've remained pretty stagnant in terms of their carbon intensity, with perhaps only a slight reduction. We must tackle this if we're to address the interlinked social, economic and environmental challenges and unlock the opportunities of regeneration. Next slide, please. So this is digging a bit more into the detail. So the Climate Change Act and the amendment to that to commit to net zero by 2050 is linked to setting carbon budgets for the UK. The fifth carbon budget was set in 2016 and limits UK gas emissions from all sources, excluding international aviation and shipping. And that runs from 2028 to 2032. The graphics to the left of the slide are taken from this and are a useful starting point for ensuring that any regeneration strategy is grounded in science. The sixth carbon budget, which was published in December 2020, does support this infographic and states that 34% of UK emissions occur directly from households. And this comes predominantly through driving of cars and the heating of homes. So then, successful regeneration needs to tackle all of these. It's not just about the buildings, but about how people travel, how they don't travel, and a whole host of other issues. Clearly, there are economic, environmental and social advantages of a holistic strategy for regeneration, not just in terms of climate change, but in affordability and wider well-being, making it easy for people to travel or not travel as much by co-locating services, employment and homes, or by ensuring that active and low carbon transport modes are preferential to car travel, and that will help us to reduce emissions from travel. One point that is interesting to note, and there's a lot of data on this, that as the carbon footprint of households continues to decrease towards 2050, we'll increasingly need to focus on reducing emissions from waste, and this includes our diet. Circular economy principles are gradually rising up the agenda and becoming disease. And these are the sorts of things we'll need to look at when looking to close the gap once our energy supply becomes completely decarbonised. Next slide, please. I just wanted to run through some of the drivers for sustainable regeneration. As I said, with climate change, with the social issues, inequality, being absolutely front and centre, that this is not about doing the right thing or about environmentalism. There are very strong regulatory and policy drivers, and some of those are shown on the screen. I've mentioned the UK carbon budget, that's right up there. Also, the pathway towards net zero is reflected in the new building regulations, Part L. We still have site-specific standards, BREEAM, Passive House, UK Green Building Council, Net Zero Building Standard, and some local requirements depending on where you are around the country. As I mentioned already, many local authorities have got climate emergencies declared and action plans that go alongside those. Also, the environmental, social and governance commitments, particularly in the private and the public sector, but where they are looking at having to meet their own corporate targets to ensure more sustainable development. Housing associations, again, have their own requirements, and I think there's an important piece around equity here, making sure that it isn't just the most affluent in society who can benefit from safe, secure, warm, climate resilient and cheaper to run homes, but making sure that everybody can live in homes that's going to help them and stand the test of time. Financial sector, really leading the charge here in terms of what projects can be invested in, and again, many really just setting a high bar for those commitments and will not invest in assets that are not sustainable and that do not lead to a sustainable return on investment. Public opinion, obviously key, rise of activism, Extinction Rebellion, Greta, I don't need to go into detail on that, but really people being more aware, younger people, different generations, really getting involved and caring about sustainability. This is all also pushing the agenda. And of course, lastly, I've mentioned it already, but the cost of living crisis and what that means in terms of the places we live, what it costs to live there, and to not just to retrofit, renew or demolish and rebuild, but the absolute what it costs to live there, essentially. All of these pointing to more sustainable regeneration being absolutely essential. Next slide, please. This is a little more detail on the road to net zero, which just highlights what has to be achieved by when each year, talks about the emissions reduction in operational carbon for buildings. Key one there being 2025. I'm sure lots of people have heard or know quite a lot about the Future Building Standard. But essentially by 2030 then, all new build has to be net zero carbon ready. What that means is that buildings don't need any further retrofit to become operational net zero once the grid has become decarbonised. And there's a lot more data behind that about the uptake of our renewables, obviously a huge offshore wind drive there. Also along the bottom, you'll see how EPC certificate ratings must need to be met by different dates as we move towards 2050, with the by 2035 operational and construction net zero carbon. So that's emissions not just that are produced by running your buildings, but actually by constructing them, the materials, the transport of those materials as well. So this is pretty soon. This is not, far in the future anymore, but will be upon us very quickly. And then we get to 2050, the net zero target. Next slide, please. So this slide just gives a couple of definitions that are helpful when we're talking about carbon from buildings. They often are misunderstood or misused. To start with, net zero does not mean zero emissions. Clearly, when we talk about net zero, it's on 1990 levels. Carbon neutral means no net release of carbon emissions, but this is often achieved by offsetting. And corporate sustainability was mentioned earlier and its own targets. But a lot of people, a lot of companies have achieved carbon neutrality, and that is by purchasing carbon offsets to balance out what they're themselves producing. Net zero carbon means that emissions are no greater than the emissions removed from the atmosphere, but aligned to limit warming to the Paris Agreement. Absolute zero carbon is when there are no emissions being produced from a product or service. I think it's important just to bear these in mind when reading policies or reports, indeed, because they can get misused. Next slide, please. I was asked to go a little bit more into detail about emissions, quite a complex area really, but you will hear reference to scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions in company reporting or in reports linked to planning applications or estates generally, and also in climate action plans and in the media. We need to consider all three if we're to get to net zero. Scope 1 emissions are those caused by the operating of company-owned or controlled assets, such as vehicles, machinery and buildings. These are the easiest to track and manage, as their emissions arising as a direct result of a company or a building. So ones you have the most control over, really. Scope 2 is about the energy that those buildings or that company uses. And again, these days we do have quite a lot of choice and can monitor where that energy is coming from. But again, this really differs by where you live and whether you're in charge of your energy and where that comes from or not. That's important to bear in mind as well in regeneration. Lastly, scope 3 emissions, which are the tricky ones really. So these are supply chain emissions or indirect emissions. So emissions that come from customers using a company's products or by suppliers making the products the company uses. So there's a longer chain of custody here, and it is more time consuming to track those. But companies, have to do it, and more we're going to have to take these into account as we are looking at reducing the carbon down from development. You'll have heard of whole life cycle carbon. This is something that, again, is really pushing up the agenda. I know in Manchester, certainly in London, whole life carbon, and the construction and development sector generally. I know some of the major house builders really looking at how they can reduce the embodied carbon in materials. You'll hear about modern methods of construction, and also just looking at newer types of products that have lower carbon cement or are built for disassembly and reuse. So a whole sort of circularity issue coming forward, and it's absolutely where we need to be if we're thinking about how we can get the most out of our materials, to keep reusing it as we go round and round that cycle. And of course, I think in the coming years, you've seen that 2035 construction net zero requirement. That is going to be something that's going to come up more and more in regeneration, and a lot more scrutiny on the building materials and reuse. Thank you. Next slide, please. I just wanted to end my section by drawing some of these strands together that we're going to be talking about through case studies. But hopefully it's been clear through the previous slides. I've said social, economic, environmental in the same sentence many times. But all of this needs regenerating. All of these needs tackling in a holistic manner. We can't just focus on carbon. We can't just focus on buildings, but we have to think about people, their lifestyles, how people use their communities day in, day out, and make sure that there's a really multifaceted way of overcoming these challenges through a holistic placemaking approach. So Gary's going to bring some of these principles to life shortly. But if you look at the list of topics on the screen, all, I think, arguably contribute to a better quality of life. By focusing on quality of life for people, as I said, whether it's economically, socially or environmentally, we can make sustainable living the easiest option for people. And through that, we can almost address climate change by accident through good design. By focusing on the natural environment, by using natural materials, by using greenery to help cool naturally, to help give places that people want to be out walking, exercising, accessing facilities on foot, by bike, we can then ensure that our regeneration projects can help reduce emissions, but are also resilient to climate change, benefit biodiversity and promote a high standard of well-being. And I know it's not easy, but I think it's by thinking of these things in the rounds that we can absolutely aim for the best outcomes. Next slide, please. We've got another poll here after that first section. So I know most people are from a local authority. So please, on a scale of 1 to 5, could you say how confident are you of being on track to reach your authority's net zero target if you have one? So 1 to 5, 1 being not at all confident, 5 being very confident. Thank you. I think once we're happy that everyone's had a go at this, we'll have the next slide. Thanks very much. Over to Gary.
So hello there, my name is Gary Stevens. I'm a chartered town planner. I'm working at Stantec as a planning director in our London office in Soho. So my background is I've got about 20 years of experience working in both the public and private sectors. Began my career as a development management at 3 local authorities in the southeast of England, and during that time I've learned much about some of the challenges local government has in meeting changing regulatory and policy requirements, as well as meeting political and public expectations on limited resources. We've seen very much in recent years increasing significance attached to the climate emergency for understandable reasons, and addressing these challenges right now is rightly on the front and centre of many of the projects that we are working on. So I originally joined Barton Wilmore, as it was then, in 2013, and we were subsequently acquired by Stantec in 2022. And during my time in planning consultancy work, I've been fortunate to work on a wide range of urban and estate regeneration projects, both with private sector developers, registered providers, and directly for local authorities as well. Several of these projects have involved public-private partnerships, joint venture working, and that's again enabled me to get a bit of an understanding of some of the challenges and opportunities these relationships can bring in delivering effective change and regeneration to our towns and cities. So also I find it incredibly rewarding to possibly contribute to the improving places we live and work, and working with the communities we often can often be in fairly deprived areas, and to help to deliver good quality accommodation that many of us will take for granted. So in this section of the presentation, I'm going to draw upon some of that experience I have as a town planner, and have witnessed changes to, witnessed some of the challenges and opportunities facing different types of regeneration projects in terms of their approach towards a net zero status. So I'll touch on some of the key stages of the decision-making process, the tools that can be employed to select the best way forward for a particular site, and the importance of working in partnership. And then we'll also touch on a case study at the end with examples of some of the initiatives that were employed there. So just looking here at our various types of regeneration. So our towns and cities have evolved over many years to create their own distinctiveness and character. And changes within the urban environment and function of our buildings has also informed our sense of place and experience of those locations. There's often a need to address changes in population, demographics, societal needs, and done well, regeneration can tackle issues of deprivation, improve life chances of residents, and trigger improvements to the wider area. So it's estimated, I think, that between about 17 to 21% of residential properties are responsible for energy-related carbon emissions globally, and around 10% of energy-related emissions come from materials used in construction. The government's also advised about 40% of the UK's total energy use comes from the heating and powering of our buildings. And as we'll starting to see those effects of climate change that Lucy's already touched on, with hotter summers, increasing flooding, and changing global temperatures, our homes and buildings need to adapt to our changing climate and reduce their impact on the environment. So regeneration has a crucial role to play, not only in shaping our experiences of towns and cities, but by cutting emissions and energy consumption. And I think the good news is I think there's a lot of knowledge and tools that we have already at our disposal to achieve reductions in emissions from our buildings. So regeneration can take a variety of forms, each with their own issues and opportunities, and we've grouped them here into sort of 4 distinct main types. So just starting to run through those and explain some of the aspects of those. Small scale sites and intensification programs. These involve either small infill type projects or extensions, both to existing buildings via horizontally or vertically, and can make targeted modest incremental change to facilitate delivery of overarching delivery development programs. These sites can be quite tricky and require careful balancing of competing objectives, often within tight site constraints. And careful thought also needs to be given at an early stage of the process to setting an appropriate sustainability targets, and so to give the design process the best chance of achieving low carbon development that is financially viable. Extension proposals in particular can be challenging to integrate with existing buildings where ambitious sustainability targets are being set, unless you can, of course, link those with a wider refurbishment program. Benefits of these sorts of projects, however, they're often shorter construction programs and can be delivered fairly quickly. The next sort of key area, and I've seen some of the comments in the chat, is the refurbishment and retrofit programs, and it's gaining a lot more traction these days within our industry. And as existing buildings are responsible for a considerable amount of our carbon emissions, there's increasing need to give consideration to those options. What's more, large-scale regeneration projects can be both costly and time-consuming to achieve, and not always viable or the right approach. So, where circumstances permit, refurbishment and retrofit programs can yield considerable embodied carbon savings and be delivered quickly with less disruption to residents, for example, compared to maybe a more comprehensive regeneration program. This said, our projects can minimise waste. Such projects can minimise waste from demolition. It also can be more difficult to realise the full environmental benefits of more modern development or overcome issues due to the constraints of working within an existing building. So again, sustainability targets need to be set early. They need to be sense checked by technical experts and viability considerations regularly through the process. Towns and city centre regeneration, third area. And many of our towns and cities have suffered decline in recent years, or suffer from poor quality buildings with limited environmental benefits. So regeneration proposals of these sorts of sites are often complex, mixed-use schemes that possess considerable construction logistic, landowner and end user challenges, and can take many years to realise. These projects obviously involve substantial amounts of demolition in order to potentially resolve urban design, technical or connectivity issues. They are, however, also have the benefit of presenting significant placemaking potential, the opportunity maybe for more ambitious, environmentally friendly visioning and creation of highly sustainable places once the land assembly process has been resolved. So reusing buildings where possible, adopting circular economy principles to minimise waste from these projects, important consideration of how to set out potential master plans to regenerate these sorts of locations. And the final area is estate renewal projects. Again, these are usually very complicated. These are some complexity around phasing, placemaking, often political issues as well as rehousing requirements having to be dealt with, and it can take many years to plan effectively and deliver. Similar to town centre regeneration, they do, however, offer potential for significant, meaningful, positive change to the quality of life and energy efficiency of housing estates, as well as embodied carbon and demolition and rebuild need to be taken into account early on in the process, and evidence-led approach to weighing the various social and environmental benefits and disbenefits of comprehensive regeneration versus retrofit refurbishment programs before deciding this is the way to go. So ultimately, repurposing our existing buildings and housing stock is crucial to achieving a step change in carbon emissions and driving forward to a net zero society. However, careful thought does need to be given on which option is the best option for any given site. Next slide, please. So this diagram here shows the various considerations and stages of the design and decision-making process to be followed when weighing up the most effective approach to a type of regeneration to be selected. The diagram shows the potential embodied carbon emission savings relative to the stage and design the stage of the design and construction process in a simple way. And those stages have been broken down according to the REBA plan of work stages, intended to indicate the opportunity for influencing resulting outcomes. The design stages and where embodied carbon, so embodied and operational carbon emissions are exhibited and noted across the top of the slide. So the icons down the right-hand side of the page refer to several of the main design, construction, operational decisions that occur throughout the development process and can influence resulting embodied carbon savings. These include choices around the siting and location of buildings, demolition or retain existing buildings, numbers of buildings, typologies, building materials, construction, emission minimization, you name it. And these have been added to the REBA stages to show where those decisions are typically taken. So let's just work our way through some of the key issues and considerations during some of those sort of main stages there of the development and construction process, and how you can influence towards achieving a net zero approach. So you won't be surprised to hear me say that working to that sort of approach is most effectively achieved by building these principles right in the very start of the process. Regeneration projects require a clear and understandable vision to be created and some strategic objectives established as to how this will be achieved. So embedding net zero principles such as passive house into a project at the very early start of the process can ensure that those ambitions are easier to realise and potentially cheaper to achieve compared to retrofitting those in later in the process. These stages also require consideration of the environmental and societal advantages and disadvantages of retaining and upgrading existing buildings versus comprehensive regeneration. So what we tend to do is a scenario test of range of options against a variety of metrics such as environmental performance, standard accommodation, compliance with policy and regulatory standards, placemaking qualities, and considering how successful different approaches could be in addressing deficiencies is often found as very much a useful starting point for us when we're looking at these sorts of schemes. So if a refurbishment and retrofit programs preferred, it's important that the considerations such as the structural and logistical challenges, plus financial implications over the lifetime of the building, are taken into account to ensure the project is deliverable and avoid considerable cost implications later in the process of an alternative approach ultimately needs to be followed. Similarly, consideration needs to be given to whether refurbishment retrofit program can overcome what are fundamental issues with the design and layout of a particular site, and that needs to be weighed up against the environmental benefits of of different approaches. It's also worthwhile thinking about whether hybrid approaches can be taken. So there may be some buildings as part of the estates whereby they're worthy of preservation. There may be historical buildings, there may be better quality buildings that don't require the level of intervention that others, or are not appropriate to the level of intervention as others. So weighing the pros and cons of that and where you can and shouldn't intervene is again something that should be grappled with early on in the process. And so lastly on this first section is this to do with working with existing communities is really important. Regeneration projects are fundamentally about people and about delivering benefits for people. Talking to residents, businesses, they can reveal challenges and issues with the existing buildings and environment, which may not be readily available from a technical assessment and such like. So to actually understand how a place operates and the challenges that may be facing in their day-to-day lives can be also very helpful in shaping master plans, proposals, but also showing achieving some engagement and buy-in to proposals at an early stage of the process, which can be beneficial later on as you get towards planning decisions and actually delivering schemes on site. So the next sort of grouping there is about design, development and coordination. And once those sort of core principles and overarching approach has been established and verified as being deliverable, the design process needs to be progressed. And just sure we'll be aware, this is the various technical issues that need to be considered, which may include bringing in some relevant technical expertise at the right time of the development process. So to sense check proposals, bringing on consultants or expertise from the wider industry at the right time is useful, just to make sure that those decisions are being fulfilled in the emerging design approach. And if things such as a passive house approach is being followed, this inevitably will influence actual design of the building, such as window openings, wall build-ups, which in turn can affect the aesthetic and layout of buildings that you're seeking to deliver. So again, having those sorts of principles established early doors would be useful. I've mentioned financials, but regular proactive cost planning should be maintained throughout the process to ensure the project remains deliverable. Adopting whole life carbon, circular economy principles here and throughout the early stages can also ensure that those underlying principles are sense checked and maintained. Continuing to engage with communities through the design process as well, making sure that whatever design options are being presented and that they suit the end user requirements and can be effective, again, is useful rather than trying to pick those sorts of issues later on in the process. And lastly, taking the time to get the design right here is often going to be beneficial later in the process, particularly in terms of securing support at planning application stage and buildability. So the more technical side of it comes in later on there, and this is typically sort of post-planning permission. It's less about adapting the design, but rather fulfilling the objectives and measures identified earlier in the design process. And they tend to require a clear tender brief is vital in establishing for contractors to be able to be sourcing materials sustainably and delivering and the ambitions of what the original vision was for the development, and also to ensure that it can be delivered as smooth as possible. The operational stages, again, at the end, they are to ensure that those enhanced environmental credentials that are actually maximised and properly used. There's no point having all of these wonderful technologies and what have you that are not actually utilised to their maximum potential, because again, these won't actually deliver the benefits that we hope they will. So for the public sector, there's a series of distinct challenges and programme implications, both in terms of the design and delivery of a project. These can be controversial and create significant local political issues. So the timing, some of these projects related to local and general election cycles needs to be carefully considered, and ideally cross-party support secured at the outset to ensure that long-term commitment for delivering those initiatives. Costs, we've mentioned already in terms of following those net zero approach and making sure those are actually clearly articulated and understood early in the process is useful to again avoid issues of over promising and under delivering. And again, expertise in at the right stage to make sure those opportunities and net zero approach is built in the design and delivery process. So move on to the next slide. So here we have talked about, I should say, the importance of weighing the significance of what can be competing issues and deciding the most effective approach. And in recent years, we've seen whole life carbon circular economy assessments have become more widely used to provide much more of an evidence-led approach to embodied carbon versus and carbon dioxide emissions over the lifetime of the building. Passive House Institute suggested that passive house can reduce heating requirements by around 75% compared to a typical new build, and can cut fuel bills by up to 90%. So the incentive of following this sort of approach is quite clear. We now regularly hear about those terms of circular economy and whole life carbon. And whilst I won't get into the details of the calculation, it's probably worth just reminding ourselves what we mean by that. So whole life carbon emissions are typically total carbon emissions resulting from the construction and use of a building over its entire life, including its demolition and disposal. They capture the building's operational carbon emissions, both from regulated and unregulated end use, as well as embodied carbon emissions, that is, the emissions from extraction of raw materials and manufacturing and transport of those to a development site, as well as the dismantling and demolition of those materials. Whole life carbon assessments can also be useful in providing recommendations of potential savings from the reuse and recycling of components at the end of the building's life, and it provides a true picture of what we mean by it. Circular economy is one where building materials are retained and in their use as the highest value as long as possible opportunity, and they're reused or recycled so to minimise residual waste. And that's a move away from the linear economic model where where materials are mined, manufactured, used, and thrown away. So on the slide here, you can see an example of a life carbon assessment. I don't intend to get into some of the technical aspects of the assessment, which is something our Stantec's energy and waste management teams can assist with. But this particular example shows the significance of building materials, which is shown here in the lighter blue colours, in contributing to those overall carbon emissions. And those figures are typically estimated by using building volumes and areas. And other contributors can include transport data, construction site impacts, waste volumes, refrigerants from leakage, annual leakage estimates from equipment like air source heat pumps, maintenance, ongoing use of water and cleaning parts of the building, repair and refurbishment data, and operational consumption values from a water and energy perspective. So the assessment takes that all into account, applies a typical assessment period, which is usually at 60 years, which is the typical lifetime of the building, and a calculation is undertaken to establish the amount of CO2 per square metre of post-floor space that will occur over the assessment period. So if we move on now to the next one. Thank you. So this is just an example of a whole life carbon assessment and the relative embodied operational carbon effects of different approaches. So we've discussed about the feasibility of retaining buildings should always be tested, and before demolition and redevelopment is typically considered. We've got three different scenarios here for an office building in Reading that our buildings team has given me for the purpose of this presentation. And scenario A considers the full demolition and rebuilding of the existing building with a 15-storey steel framed building. Scenario B considers the refurbishment of the existing 1973 concrete floor plates and vertically extending the building by 4 stories. Scenario C employs the same refurbishment proposals as scenario B, but employs ethical design choices wherever possible, including the use of low carbon concrete and recycled steel. So the whole life carbon analysis in this case demonstrated that the new build project resulted in 3.25 times more embodied carbon than refurbishment and extension proposals in scenario B, and 3.94 times more than the ethical cut and carve approach considered in scenario C. So while building performance and body carbon emissions will vary from site to site and will need to be weighed against other commercial and design quality considerations, the benefits of working with the existing building are potentially clear from this analysis. Next slide, please. And Lucy mentioned about partnership working, and that is essential to any regeneration project. And here are some of the key words you may typically associate with partnership working. The most successful projects often identify the individuals and groups who can positively shape regeneration, the programs, and unite around a common goal, a set of objectives to basically deliver an improved quality of life for all. And it's great to hear about some of the recent announcements from Homes England in providing further support to regeneration projects. We're welcoming their involvement in bringing their expertise and technical know-how to be able to unlock what are often very complex and tricky schemes. So understanding the priorities among different groups in the community, as well as those interested in the actual land itself, is vital to establishing that clear and simple vision to underpin a regeneration programme. And that involves parties being honest in what they want to achieve, maintain the main challenges involved, understanding their journey to a net zero and how that can be delivered. The residents, as I've mentioned, and tenants can offer invaluable information and how a home or a building operates, ideas how they, those deficiencies can be resolved, and measures to improve their day-to-day lives. And regular, effective engagement with those residents throughout the design process can also help generate that buy-in and drive those projects forward. I think the other sort of element of it as well is having a championing these at the political level. I've seen the success and the power that you have as either at a political level or even at residence level of having someone who can speak confidently and passionately about their improvements to their homes and improvements to their place to live and the issues with their current accommodation that these sorts of proposals seek to attend to. So I'm just going to move on now to the next slide, which I think should be the case study. Yes, it is. Thank you. So we've discussed some of the underlying principles, approaches associated with striving towards a net zero approach, and we've now got a case study, how we can explore how low carbon initiatives have been employed as part of the current proposal. So this is the Ferraris Park estate in Acton, which is this is a comprehensive regeneration proposal, and that's involving a joint venture between developer Mount Anvil and registered provider Peabody. I know it is in a local authority driven example, but there are ones out there as well, which but this one actually felt like a sort of interesting example of one thing that's actually being delivered on site currently. And as part of that decision-making process, there was very much a collaborative sort of consideration of the various environmental approaches with the local authority and the Greater London Authority, GLA, to maximise those carbon reductions as part of the design for the master plan. So I'll just begin with an overview of the project, and then I'll turn to some of those environmental credentials of it. So the site's in the London Borough of Ealing, just north of Acton Town. There's a short distance from Acton Mainline Crossrail station, which you can see in the bottom left corner of the image on screen here. The estate formerly comprised 230 largely social rented homes that were built in the late 1980s. Those buildings were poor quality, unsuited to modern living, and inefficient in energy terms. Many of those homes were overoccupied, fell well below modern space standards, and particularly in terms of bedroom numbers and sizes, or were poorly insulated and didn't benefit from any adequate heating systems. Issues of antisocial behaviour and crime also reported on the estate, and despite all this, there was a strong community spirit and an active residents group. And I've seen one of the comments in the chat about maintaining or avoiding, I should say, gentrification of these sorts of estates, and as we'll hear, that was very much part of thinking to avoid that, to make sure you retain that community spirit, you retain those people who are living there as front and centre as part of the new development. And I'll touch on in a minute as to how. So those existing homes were owned and managed by Catalyst Housing and now part of Peabody, and originally designed as conventional market housing, rather than the sort of design and space standards you typically now expect of modern affordable housing. So by the early 2010s, it had become evident that the estate needed a significant investment, and Catalyst took the decision to explore options on how to improve the quality of accommodation on the estate. So as a starting point, there was consideration given to a refurbishment programme and whether that was feasible. So a variety of structural and environmental surveys were commissioned to examine the condition of the buildings and whether a refurbishment programme could address those deficiencies of the estate. And whilst some of this work predated what we typically now will do in terms of whole of carbon assessments, consideration was given to whether or not improvements to the building fabric and other interventions could overcome the energy and thermal problems associated with these poorly constructed homes. The quality of the accommodation and surrounding environment was also taken into account in understanding the implications for the well-being of residents, which is something Lucy mentioned earlier. So Catalyst worked with their residents to understand the issues that they were facing, concerns with the existing accommodation. Residents steering group was formed at an early stage of the process, so to provide a focal point for the community and a forum for feedback. Residents indicated considerable problems with the existing buildings, poor insulation, energy efficiency issues, the lack of outdoor space as a major issue as well with their physical health and well-being. Variety of options, including keeping the estate as is, refurbishing, a refurbishment programme or comprehensive regeneration programmes was discussed with both local planning authority and the GLA. And the options involving retaining some of the better quality buildings were also on the periphery of the estate, also explored. So the findings from that analysis basically it concluded that the structural, physical, and environmental challenges associated with the homes on the estate could not be meaningfully overcome with the refurbishment programme alone. The major deficiencies of the layout and quality of the accommodation would remain, as would the absence of any outdoor amenity space. And whilst improvements to energy performance of the existing buildings could be achieved, the magnitude of those enhancements would be limited. So the local and strategic planning authorities are also broadly supportive of the opportunity to bring forward better quality homes on the estate. As a result, the decision was therefore taken in consultation with the local authority to pursue a comprehensive regeneration proposal. But the terrace properties you can see in the bottom right corner of the image there, they were decided to be retained and excluded from the regeneration on the basis that they offered a better quality accommodation that could be improved through subsequent refurbishment programmes. So the master plan was subsequently prepared to regenerate the estate, and residential-led mixed-use scheme up to 1,228 homes was prepared in a variety of mid-rise and tall buildings up to 24 stories in height. And about 46% of the habitable rooms in the development were to be provided in affordable tenures. Supporting social infrastructure in the form of flexible commercial floor space, affordable workspace, community facilities such as the residence lounge, co-working space, community centre, and the library of things were also included in the proposals, and they were designed to be made available to the wider community, not just the residents of the estate, so to create a more inclusive environment. The master plan also sought to deliver a high-quality public realm, as well as public, communal, and private amenity spaces across the estate, as well as a variety of children's play spaces. During the extensive programme of engagement undertaken over several years, residents were invited to participate in the design process and feed into the proposals through the resident steering group. And high on the agenda was the need to deliver energy-efficient, sustainable homes that would help reduce energy uses and household bills, so not to repeat the problems of the past. Having secured planning permission in the site demolition and construction commenced in March 2021 and continues today. The project also has been highly commended at the 2021 RTPI Planning Awards as an example, good example of affordable housing and planning. We can move on to the next slide. So some of the environmental principles were enshrined into the design process, with the applicant team committed to employ measures that comfortably exceed building regulation requirements. Regular testing was carried out throughout the design development process to ensure embodied carbon emissions were minimised and opportunities taken for sustainable construction choices taken wherever possible. A fabric-first approach was adopted to ensure that the efficiency measures exceeded building regulations. And they were employed to minimise heating demand as well. So those decisions were driven by a desire to create a sustainable form of development as possible, and thereby benefit existing and future residents through lower household bills as well. The energy strategy for the development originally was based upon a gas-fired CHP engine, which was the preferred technology at the time. However, during the design process, the preference for all electric-based systems that would ultimately facilitate the clean energy systems Lucy's touched on earlier were considered. And working with the council, with the GLA's energy teams, the applicant developed a decarbonisation strategy to alter the energy strategy from the use of the fossil fuels to an all-electric air source heat pump and photovoltaic system. And that's enabled nearly a 50% on-site reduction in carbon emissions beyond building regulations Part L. And for financial contribution was also paid to the local authority towards carbon offsetting initiatives such as retrofitting existing housing stock, so to enable a net zero approach overall to be achieved. As I mentioned, sort of regular checks on whole life carbon were carried out, and this included working with the local and strategic planning authorities to ensure that standards were being met and exceeded wherever possible. And that enabled the carbon emissions associated with the development fall comfortably below the GLA's benchmark standards. And the variety of measures were promoted to achieve this, which included ethical concrete finishes, innovative cement mixes to optimise thermal mass performance of the buildings and reduce embodied carbon, future demolition and deconstruction opportunities to allow considerate dismantling of existing buildings and thereby keeping the use of energy-intensive things like welding to a minimum. End of life be completely recycled and only new recycled steel to be installed. Reducing the volume of non-load bearing walls as far as possible to again reduce the associated embodied carbon, removing suspended ceilings and allowing exposed building surfaces where that was appropriate for the use of the building. Durable materials that reduce the need for frequency of refurbishment. And buildings where there's a high glazing ratio adopt sustainable procurement techniques, including specifying windows that have a low embodied carbon. And also there was an extensive maintenance and repair schedule to ensure that specific materials and pieces of equipment could remain in situ during their expected lifespan. And in addition to that, regular circular economy workshops were held with the applicant and the design team to establish a strategic approach to assessing emerging designs, and against that principles of and some of these are included some of the following. So minimizing construction waste to no more than 11.1 tonnes per 100 square meters, ensuring 95% of non-hazardous construction demolition waste will be reused or recycled, 95% of excavation waste to be put to beneficial use, which included the use of putting into piling mats for buildings, hard standing within the development, prioritising the use of materials with low embodied carbon content, storing plasterboard offcuts, which could be used for later on in the process, use of prefabricated materials such as bolt-on balconies and internal fixtures and fittings that could be dismantled and easily reused if needed, and procuring materials in a sustainable manner, as I mentioned earlier, with such as all timber on used as part of the development was to be sustainably sourced. And all homes, for example, also provided with dedicated recycling and food waste facilities, and a user guide was given to residents to make sure they would make the most of the various facilities that are on offer. So lastly, the site also benefits from excellent connections to the public transport, and with access to the Elizabeth line, shortly located from a distance from the site. So that highly accessible location also allowed the opportunity to deliver a low traffic neighbourhood with minimising car parking and prioritising pedestrian orientated streets with generous areas of soft landscaping. Measures resulted in a reduction of traffic movements compared to the historic use of the site. So traffic movements went down overall. And the quality of the public realm was also considered an important part of it, with an urban greening factor score beyond that as set out in the London plan achieved, as well as significant biodiversity net gain improvements, enhancement overall. So Priory Park provided an early template for current regeneration proposals and exploring opportunities for refurbishment considered, but in this case, but not found to result in the same level of benefits that would be delivered from comprehensive regeneration. But that's not to say that's going to be true in all cases. So having decided to pursue a demolition rebuild program, the applicants have endeavoured to reduce carbon emissions with sustainable development as possible. And going forward, we're seeing these initiatives and innovations continuing to evolve, and a more extensive testing and analysis being carried out in support of emerging projects. We can just go on to the next final conclusion slide. So in conclusion, we have a chronic undersupply of homes, and need to regenerate many of our towns and cities is more important than ever, in how to deal with deprivation that we can find in various places of the UK. Lucy's touched on the greenhouse gas emissions must be brought to net zero by 2050, and construction remains a significant source of emissions overall. So again, we have our part to play in trying to minimise those to a greater extent than they already are. Place-based approaches, must tackle those environmental, economic, physical, and social issues simultaneously. And regeneration must have climate change adaptation and principles at its core. To actually introduce those principles later in the process often is much more challenging to achieve successfully. And that also requires a multi-pronged approach, with no single organisation having all the answers to these questions, but working collaboratively with different organisations and having champions of regeneration projects to deliver those regeneration vision principles is vital to their ongoing success. So thank you for listening. That's the end of my section now. I think so. I'll hand back to David to wrap up.
Thank you, Gary. That was very interesting, and we've had quite a few questions and comments in the chat as we've gone. So we have answered some of those questions in the chat, but we have been curating them, and we might ask a couple of questions again, just to get some conversation going. On the case study, Gary, there was a few comments about the process. So what happened to all the material from the demolished homes that on that site, the 230 homes?
I think, as I'm sort of mentioned, as the principle is about retaining, I think I said up to 95% of the waste materials, and they were either reused, either as part of some of the brickwork of some of the building, if the bricks were suitable, or if they weren't suitable for actually being physically reused, they were able to be integrated in some of the piling mats into the base of the buildings, so to act as part of the foundation systems, and off-site, some elements of on-site crushing and recycling of those into some of the hard standing as well within the material used as part of that landscaping scheme as well. So the vast majority of it, as I say, was recycled site.
Thank you. Okay, so we've got a question also about the rehoming of residents on the estate. So how many of them got rehomed on the new estate, and were they consulted beforehand?
The principle was to provide replacement homes for everybody. Everybody had the opportunity to return, the right to return to the redeveloped estate. As you probably appreciate, the first phase always requires an off-site decant because you don't have a replacement home, new home available to them. So that first phase is to be involved, that off-site decant, but they will get, as I say, given assurances and the opportunity to come back if they wanted to. And that was a very much residents' choice driven approach. And then the phasing of the scheme enabled the subsequent homing to be, so people from the next demolition phase would be homed in the first construction phases. The affordable housing as well was also front loaded very much into the early phases of the scheme, so to give the opportunity for people to stay on the estate if they wanted to. And some of those homes actually are now starting to be occupied. The first phases, which were on the left hand side of the image when I showed close to the Crossrail station, they're all being occupied right now. Very much principles to keep the community together. And I think I didn't mention one of the other things, just maybe to touch on, was about avoiding that gentrification approach, avoiding people getting lost within and the community getting lost within a broader development. And one of the things we worked on is an arts and cultural program as part of the scheme, began to celebrate what was distinctive about the existing community. And to build that actually into the design of the scheme, both through artwork, installations, actually events and cultural activities are taking place on the site to celebrate what is the community. So not only are they given the promise of the home, but what is Friary Park, what is distinctive and to be celebrated about it, and reminding ourselves that that's the case was, say, front and centre of the vision for the master plan.
Thank you very much, Gary. I'm going to ask Lucy a question now on how do we balance the need to insulate our homes for winter against introducing cooling methods for increasingly hot summers, which both impact on energy consumption.
Yeah, a good question, particularly in the UK where we definitely have seasons. I think a lot of it just goes back to passive design principles. You'll hear passive house a lot, or designing, considering the sort of the natural pathway of the sun and how that changes throughout the year. I think with a lot of my else, I go back to nature, and I think it is true if we look at orientation of buildings, where your building openings are, how sort of tight your building fabric is, how airtight it is. With natural cooling, I mean, it's interesting. I myself live in a fairly new build, but it's still 9 years old, and residents on my street a few weeks ago when we had the heat waves, and how on earth do you deal with this? And things like putting the blinds down, you hear about louvres or solar shading on buildings now, so stopping that solar gain coming in when it's hot and then allowing the building to ventilate at night when it's coolest. There's, I'm not a building services engineer or an architect, but there are some quite straightforward passive design principles that you can bring in so that you're taking advantage of the cooler airflow through the building, that you're positioning it to take advantage of the solar gain when you need it, and obviously reducing that when you don't. Also, just we've heard about things like the urban greening factor, bringing tree-lined streets, just bringing nature back into where we are. It is difficult, particularly where you've got town centre or constrained sites, but as Gary showed, I saw some comments in the chat where it doesn't look that green, but actually some of the images Gary showed of Friary Park with those sort of the greening of roofs with trees tucked into pockets. You can have things like living walls, but using nature to help cool the air around and provide that shading. So it's about going back to basics. Some of the natural, bringing more use of like timber and more breathable materials in, that can all help as well. There's a lot of good guidance online. I think some of them are at some good links at the end of the presentation that can be shared if people are interested.
Thanks, Lucy. So a question for Connie now. So why do you think it is we always look at rebuild first and deem that reusing existing buildings as a poor option?
Thanks, David. Yeah, I mean, I think, as I said in the chat, I think this will change now because we need to look at the embodied carbon of building materials, particularly steel is extremely carbon intensive and creates lots of emissions when it's created. I think there is a balance there, though, in that often when a building is demolished, the new building that is erected is much more sustainable in use, and so that its operational carbon will be a lot better than the previous building, which might not have been fit for purpose. But there is a bit of a halfway house that could be considered as well. So there's a scheme near St Pancras where they're looking at retaining the facade and particularly retaining the foundations, where the cement in the foundations is very kind of carbon intensive. And that's possibly a happy medium in that you can deliver a new sustainable building while reducing that embodied carbon. So yeah, I think it's something that will change as we move through.
Thank you. So I'm going to go slightly off piste here with a question of my own. So about embodied carbon, would you describe it as a property of the building material that's inside, or is it a sunk cost? So we don't consider the embodied carbon of existing buildings, but only as like the replacement cost. So would it be that you could have a better outcome by demolishing and using, say, timber rather than retaining an existing concrete building? Maybe Gary, you could try that question.
Yeah. Well, I think it's a bit of both, to be honest with you. It's not just considering the effect and the loss of the existing buildings. It's also how then the new development and the impacts that has operationally and construction wise, that actually, the embodied effects of those different things. So it's not just as probably easy to say it's how much waste there is from demolition of an existing building. There's a blend of various contributing factors within that overall assessment. And that as well, you can also include things like transport data as well, how we're using it, so how many car trips associated with it. I mean, the example I showed was a low car development, so it didn't have much in the way of a transport related impact, whereas other schemes may be more car reliant, and so that can have a different, more pronounced effect within the overall assessment of it all. So yeah, there's different things I would say within that.
Thanks. So I've got another question for Lucy. So it's about the location of developments, and do we need to have a greater focus on choosing where we put sustainable buildings because sometimes the location is inherently unsuitable?
Absolutely. I mean, it's a tricky one, but it's really needs considering in the round. So of course, at local plan level, supposed to identify land that can be taken forward for development, so a plan-led system, and potential site allocations are appraised, obviously, on their sustainability credentials still while we have that process. And clearly, transport is a key contributor of emissions. There's a few things to bear in mind as well. Obviously, the uptake of electric vehicles, again, interesting one around equity. They are still expensive. It's not like everybody in society can purchase or buy an electric vehicle. But we know since COVID, just our travel patterns are changing anyway. Things like micro-mobility, public transport becoming electrified. And just generally, as we move to 2050, we know from government data that, and the department, that our grid is becoming more and more decarbonised. So transport will reduce in its carbon intensity anyway. But also, when we're looking at, I think it depends whether you're looking at town centre places where you more like to have regeneration, or urban extensions and bigger strategic sites. They have different challenges. So I think within urban areas, absolutely we should be looking at the locations of services. There are some great examples, and again, I mentioned Friary Park. There's other ones we've worked on where through that regeneration project and through partnering with businesses around those local areas, you can actually improve things like pedestrian connectivity, and wayfinding and that sort of thing. So a local service might not have been very far at all, but people just weren't really cognizant of a safe and an easy way to walk or cycle there. So I think there's a lot we can do through regeneration about just almost helping people wayfind and navigate their own communities by providing a safe or a lit or just a signed route that shows how you get to these places. Things like resident welcome packs, here are your nearest services, here are your nearest transport links, things like that. It sounds almost, it's common sense, and it almost sounds like, well, you should know where these things are, but it's really interesting how some of the places on our own doorsteps aren't particularly accessible, they're known about. But there is, I think, through policy, really strong drivers around clearly around sustainable location. And I think more and more as this whole life carbon circular economy principles become more embedded in policy, then looking at sites that are in a more town centre situation where there tend to be better links anyway will score higher just because of things like embodied carbon that we've talked about already. So reusing brownfield sites rather than just starting from scratch again. Hope that helps a bit. It's not
Thanks
an easy
very
one.
much,
No worries.
Lucy. So we've now come to the end of the presentation. So thank you, Lucy, Connie, and Gary for your presentations, and to everybody for attending. So this slide, we're not going to dwell on it, but this is some links to some tips and some further reading that you'll be able to peruse on the slides at your leisure. So we'll just leave it on that, and that's the end of our time today and end of our presentation. So again, thank you very much to our presenters and to everyone who attended, and I hope you found that as interesting and useful as I did. So thank you everyone, and have a good afternoon.